Welcome to another episode of Russia Unfiltered. I'm Jeremy Morris.
I'm James Pearce.
I'm Jonny Tickle.
Today we're going to discuss the question, is Moscow still the most livable city in the world? And why would we say that? Well, just before the war, the UN's Global Cities Prosperity Ranking saw Moscow take first place for livability. Today, Moscow is conspicuous by its absence from all kinds of city ratings. However, there's no reason to think that Moscow's top scores for quality of life and well-being have changed since then. But what does livability really mean? Moscow is already a leader in smart city projects, a world leader in car-sharing apps, top 10 for internet speed, and of course, for a non-Asian city, it's right at the top in terms of video surveillance and face recognition. So the smart city is two sides of the same coin. You could be traceable everywhere, but you can also benefit from a single electronic system for doctor's appointments, school timetabling, and public Wi-Fi coverage. Does smartness mean the human side gets left behind? And so the original City Prosperity Index was based on 6 criteria: productivity, infrastructure, quality of life, equity, environment, and governance. Moscow does best, or did best, on infrastructure and e-governance. And perhaps they're the topics that we'll start with. What do they actually mean in practice, gentlemen? Infrastructure and e-governments, in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, infrastructure, yeah. I mean, obviously the first thing when you get to Moscow you notice is the metro. Not just, these stations are very clean and wonderful, which they are, but it's just how easy it is to get around. You know, the London Underground is kind of a maze. I mean, it's not as easy as Rome, obviously, Moscow, because there's just 2 lines in Rome. But even once you get out of the metro, I mean, the buses are very well interlinked. Yeah, so that would be the infrastructure. But there's also, again, the general city infrastructure. I mean, the utilities are all just fine. Everyone has access to sort of clean water and everything. Well, yeah, I didn't really think about it much beyond that, I'll be honest, until we decided to do this episode. I mean, every metro station has a shopping mall or Torgovy centre. Not every English town has one of those. I'll let Jonny jump in because I can see he's bursting to...
Well, I think if we talk about infrastructure, the obvious first thing we do think about is public transport, which you've mentioned. The metro is great. Like you mentioned, buses. But what I think is great about Moscow infrastructure is that it just keeps constantly improving. So there's new metro lines. That's the obvious one. But there's new parks being landscaped. There's new cycle paths popping up. There's like playgrounds that didn't exist before and now do. So it's like the sort of urban machine of Moscow. It just keeps going. It keeps going. I think as well, infrastructure, if we talk about digital infrastructure, that's a very important thing for Moscow. 2, you have one portal, one app to handle all sorts of stuff, including bills and taxis and getting your kids into school, and you can even book doctor's appointments on your phone. I think Moscow's bureaucracy, e-bureaucracy, is a infrastructure that works really well. I would also say, sort of linked to infrastructure, safety. I think the city feels safe and orderly. You can walk home at 2 a.m. without fear. And I think that security is part of the infrastructure. And just in general, I think one of the things I like about living in Moscow is that not only is the infrastructure great, but it's constantly developing. It's constantly getting better. So
unlike other cities.
I'm sure I'll come up with in this podcast lots of things I think have gotten worse in Russia in the last 2 or 3 years. But one thing that hasn't gotten worse is the infrastructure.
But of course, we're talking about Moscow, not the rest of the country. And again, James, you've lived in some other cities, as have I. I don't know about, I mean, I know, Johnny, I'm sure you've traveled around a lot and experienced a lot of
I've
other
been to
places,
loads, but I've never
but
lived anywhere else.
right. But certainly, I think for the person, for the listener or viewer that doesn't know Moscow, it's hard to grasp what you said, Johnny, which is the expansion of the city's infrastructure in step with its growth in terms of immigration, which we touched upon last week. I mean, I lived in Russia I lived in Moscow for the first time a long time ago, and for me, every time I go back, it's bewildering because of the number of new metro stations in particular and light rail. I don't know what the technical term would be, but obviously not just metro, but light rail. And so, there's a concept called New Moscow, which I'm sure you guys know about, which it's hard to imagine in the UK a city being able to expand beyond a kind of geographical boundary. But obviously Moscow has done that, and it's not only done that, it's expanded its rapid transit system and maintained that, right? So that even if you live, when I was first living in Moscow, the idea that you would live in beyond the ring road, which of course still exists and has expanded hugely, would be absurd because there'd be no way that you could use public transport to get to the centre. And
Yeah.
so that's been an amazing thing that it's broken that natural boundary which for
I
the
mean, if
whole
I
of the
may just
Soviet
jump
period
in there, because one thing
was there.
I mean, you can't help but notice, so a new metro station pops up, perhaps even on a new line. So when I moved to Moscow 2013, on the red line in the southwest, the last station was Yugo-Zapадnaya. Now it goes all the way down, I think, to Kommunalka, which is miles
I think it's
away
past
from
that now.
civilization. It's even past that, right? But you get settlements open with them. Now, I mean, in the UK, we're talking about, we're going to build 12 new towns in the Parliament. Good luck with that. But even if you build those towns and you physically get the houses standing, there's not going to be the infrastructure to go with it. You're not going to have the roads, the bus stops, and so on. Moscow has been very good at that, I think, because again, in the absence of checks and balances and democracy, the governments can just push ahead with whatever they want. And they do realise, again, Moscow is the economic pull of the rest of Russia. But, I mean, you mentioned, Jeremy, I've lived in other places. Now, Vladimir has new settlements. There's no metro. There are still trolley buses. Moscow got rid of its trolley buses. There are still marshrutkas where you have to tell them, stop, please, and you pass your change up to the front. That still happens even in Yekaterinburg. They still have the marshrutkas from the... Now, this is Russia's fourth biggest city, and now where we live, I won't say it just because I don't want people, our fans turning up at my house, dying to see me early hours of the morning. But it took them years to build a tram stop, and it cost billions of rubles to build one tram line that goes out to one of these new micro regions. And again, they could have done it, and Russia isn't short of land and wasteland at that. But it is just, again, the centre takes away from the region. Sorry, I'll let you guys jump in. I was waffling.
Maybe Johnny, obviously you have a very different experience because this is kind of like normal for you. It's weird for me, but it's normal for you.
Yeah, it's interesting just listening to what James said there. It reminded me of the ZIL area of Moscow. Um, if anyone doesn't know, ZIL was a huge car plant. And they also did trucks. Actually, during the Soviet Union, it was famous because it made all the limousines all the Soviet dignitaries would go around in. And then basically before the Soviet Union, the plant falls into disrepair, which was just sat there doing nothing. There's this huge space, pretty central in Moscow, where there was nothing happening, this wasteland. And then a decade ago, they decided they're going to knock it all down and build a brand new area of the city. And they've done that now. So about 3 years ago, people started moving in, and now it's this huge modern, sort of its own little part of the city where you never have to leave it if you never want to, because it's got everything you could want. And just, I believe it was last month, or maybe it was in the start of this month, they opened a new metro station there, which actually goes to New Moscow. That's the direction the new metro line is going. I believe it's line number 15 or 16. It's some absurd
Something
number
like
like that. Yeah, and because there's so many lines, they're running out of colours to do it on the map, so it's sort of a darky, sort of tropical green.
I remember,
yeah,
a few years ago as well, a lot of the kind of rich people in Moscow were looking at moving out there, and I was on one of the main headhunter sites, Headhunter.ru, and a school where, are you interested in coming to work here? And it was literally just a couple of rich people that had set up a school. They're like, hey, we're going to be part of this new... that doesn't quite happen in other cities as well, I've noticed. Now, Johnny, you said it's got everything they want there. I mean, yeah, you have the shops. As soon as they build it, there's the pharmacy. There's the, a magnet or something like that goes with it. And, I suppose we could talk about this, dictatorships or autocracies versus democracies at getting things done. But yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, I suppose I get the appeal of of why just that efficiency. I'm not saying I'm supporting autocracies here. I'm just saying I understand the appeal, and I think perhaps where Western democracies might be slipping behind is in actually just they don't look like they're achieving much in comparison sometimes. Jeremy.
Well, I mean, we should inject a note of caution in that.
Yes.
Moscow is 10%, a little bit more of the population, but it gets this incredibly disproportionate amount of spending, and I forget the budget. The city budget is enormous. The city budget, when you kind of translate it into what it can actually purchase, right, for local people in the local context, it makes other city budgets, even in Europe and the United States, look quite modest. So it's really... it's a kind of function of the political system in that, regardless of the kind of government, the idea is that if you keep people in Moscow happy, then the rest of the country doesn't matter. And I think, James, you've already touched on this, and I could certainly say the same in my experience. When you come to Moscow from somewhere else, you feel this kind of conflict, right? And that I am always overwhelmed and impressed by things like we've just been talking about, mass transit, but it does come at the expense of the rest of the country, right? And it does mean that Moscow is this monster that sucks energy literally from the rest of the country, and its government could really, its government, I think, if we're going to be totally honest, works in an incredibly inefficient way in spending that money. And despite the kind of governance that Moscow has and Russia has, it has this result that makes Moscow, as we've said, a livable city in terms of infrastructure. Well, at least public infrastructure. We'll talk about roads a bit later. But do either of you want to come back in?
Yeah, I was just... but on that, because it just keeps growing and it is unsustainable, public services in Moscow are being stretched thin for the locals. And that is going to be a reckoning one day in the not too distant future. And Jeremy might know a bit more about it just because of the research he does. But I think in 2006 and again 2012, there was something called Min Rayon, which the government set up to try and kind of replicate Moscow in other cities. And they chose about 10 to 12 cities where they were going to have like a ZIL in these cities. There was like Nizhny Novgorod, there was Rostov-na-Don, I should say, sorry. A few of the other millioniki, which for our irregular listeners, which means Russian cities with a population of over 1 million. I think there's 15 now.
15,
maybe,
right?
Yeah, something like that. But it failed because nobody wanted to move into the arse end of nowhere in a second-rate city when you may as well just live in the heart of it.
Well, this is where Johnny maybe could come in, because I think he probably knows more than we do about this, but my impression is that a lot of it is because, for example, ZIL, that investors in services such as bars, restaurants, shops. They know that they can make money in Moscow because the
Yes.
spending power is there, but the spending power is not there almost anywhere else in Russia apart from the very, very center of the millioniki, as you said, James. But maybe, Johnny, you see this up close and personal, right? The change in the service offering.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of blame you can place on the government, but in the end, we can blame capital too. Uh, People, these companies, they build where they think they can make money, and the fact is that when you build a new housing complex, very central in Moscow, there's going to be bars and cafes that want to be there on day one. Shops want. There's a big supermarket chains will fight over having that big space on the first floor. So the money is there, and what the government has done about that is what it does when it comes to things like planning permission. It requires these companies to build things like schools and hospitals based on the amount of people who are going to be living there, which means that the infrastructure that sort of the Moscow government sort of forces infrastructure to keep up. I mean, during the Soviet Union, I mean, anyone who's been to Russia or I guess anywhere else in the former Soviet Union knows this. You see an old Soviet building, and you can basically guess everything that will be on the ground floor, and you can guess there's going to be a school there, there's going to be a kindergarten there, and a kindergarten there, because that's just what the government did. They planned everything meticulously. Now, it's not planned like that, but the government does force these companies to do this. So the fact is, if you have to do this, you have to build a school, you have to build kindergartens, you have to build a hospital or a clinic, which eventually you're just going to give over to the government anyway. It has to be a profitable business. So
Yeah,
the fact that you
and
can
you
do
have
that
to
in
get
Moscow,
people to
build all these
move there. Yeah.
apartments, yeah. So that's cutting off. That's going out of your profit from selling all these apartments. So Moscow's the best place to do that because people are going to spend and they're going to spend a lot of money to buy brand new apartments.
Well, yeah, just where we live in Yekaterinburg, I mean, there's now, I think we've got in our micro region, there's 4 schools. One of them's like a lyceum. One of them, it's a gymnastics lyceum. One of them it's a gymnasium, but they've got a very good like hockey. They're connected with a local hockey club. So to kind of get people to move there, they sort of forced, they had to give people a reason. There is a good school there, and as you open these businesses, well, you need teachers there. Well, you need good teachers to teach at this good gymnastics lyceum because you want people to go and study there as well. And that again is more money coming out of the government budget. Teacher salaries. They don't pay their pensions, luckily, like in the UK with teacher pensions, so they save on that. But you've also got to, as Johnny was saying, who's going to live there outside of Moscow? Well, you're going to try to bet that it's going to be young families. Now, if you look at policies on trying to get people to have more children, there is a line you can draw. If you have more children and you move here to this nice place with this nice school, we might not need Moscow later. But again, it doesn't always work like that. And again, the Golden Ring, which I'm writing my book, Kostroma, Suzdal, you can't get the planning permission. Why? UNESCO, you can't build more than 2 stories in Suzdal. You have to expand outwards, which is very hard to do on historic lands. Kostroma has similar problems. I can see Jeremy. Yeah, I think I know what you're going to say.
Well, I mean, I was going to say we should, again, for our audience that may be uninformed, we should give a little bit more detail about some of these things. So when we were talking about the expansion of Moscow beyond the Ring Road, what again makes it unfathomable to a lot of people is that these are extremely dense high-rises that are built on green fields or brownfields beyond the Ring Road. And so this is what Russians call a new construction, Novostroika, right? And as you said, James, that's not possible because the demand is not there, but also because of some planning rules elsewhere. People are often to get one of these properties, you have to pay usually an upfront fee before it's even construction has even started. So the risk is actually
Greater.
shifted onto the individual. As again, we
Onto the
should say,
consumer,
so much risk is shifted onto the individual. And right now, I mean, obviously, we're not here to kind of do like completely economic analysis of what's going on in Russia right now. But it looks like, the bottom is going to fall out of the housing market in some places.
There is going to be a housing bubble, I think.
Because I mean, let's take these districts that we talked about in Moscow, right? Even an hour, 20 minutes on the extremely efficient and fast metro, people are putting down huge deposits and paying their mortgages even before the building has been started, right? Even before the foundations have been laid. So we should also say, that rents and housing prices in big cities are in a bubble. And of course, the war has made it so much worse. And because of this continuation of an existing structural problem, which is that, if you want to have a good life, as we've talked about, really you need to live in a city of 1 million people. So that attracts it's insatiable demand, which we talked about last year. But you guys also were touching on another historical kind of quirk, which is this, as you said, you live, James, in a micro district, right? A mikrorayon, right? And this is, in fact, a Soviet era kind of concept of, and you mentioned this before, Jonny, the 15-minute city, right? Say what you like about the Soviet period, they were ahead of their time in that they understood that to make a livable city, you had to have amenities. And of course, you, James, talked about schools and kindergartens and hospitals, doctors' surgeries, right? But also shops, right? And so we kind of have that legacy, even though the urban environment has been densified hugely. We still have this ideal of the micro district, right? This experiment. But what about green spaces? Because we talked about amenities as in from the consumer point of view. But what about green spaces? For me, what makes Moscow still a great place is that despite this kind of Wild West situation when it comes to construction, a lot of people say that Moscow is incredibly badly planned, right? Because basically people that have power in the construction industry can put up buildings wherever they want. There's even a concept called the privatization of sunlight, where, you get a nice high-rise flat, and within a couple of years, you don't have a view anymore because somebody's built another high-rise in front of you. But for me, it still remains, Moscow remains livable because it has a large amount of green spaces.
Go on, John.
Yeah, I think that links actually quite well to what I was saying about ZIL, because it was this huge factory, really, really big. If you've never been, you can't understand just how huge the area was. And while it was operating as a factory, and even in the last 20 years when there's been nothing there, just like a dead factory, by the River Moscow, it was awful, it was polluted, it was really disgusting. And now, when they've built this huge housing district, Russians, or maybe it's Muscovites, I don't know, really care about these green spaces. So that whole river area has become a nice, walkable, really beautiful area to walk by the river, in an area where nobody has walked for decades because it was disgusting and it was factories and it was where ships moved things. It was awful. Also, in that same area where the old construction line was in the factory, that's now a long park. So companies know that people value this kind of thing. So these are spaces that they're going to just build more houses. And instead, they've built green spaces. And of course, green space means you've got some flat land, which means you can put a metro station there too. It all links very well. So I think you're right. One great thing about Moscow is how many green spaces there are. And even with all this new housing, all these new buildings, people are still demanding green spaces, which means capital knows we need to build a park in the middle of this.
Yeah, we were talking about the Red Line earlier. One of the newer stations, Filatovlug, that's the name of the forest, where you can go and walk and have a barbecue, and then the flats are
It's the name
just
of the station,
outside
yeah.
on the edge of that. Yeah, they're just on the edge of that. But I mean, there's not a lot there. I mean, it's by Muscovsky and it's by a couple of other like small towns in the Moscow. I suppose it's just about the Moscow region. But yeah, also because if we're going to talk about green space, I suppose we should talk about ecology. Because in the Urals, it's notoriously bad. A lot of factories. I mean, we're like a hub. A lot of trains, a lot of lorries, a lot of warehouses, a lot of metallurgy, a lot of chemicals and stuff. But we also get a lot of forest fires around here. Now, we've got, just vast amounts of forestry, lots of local, it's famous, the Ural region, for precious stones like jade. There's that brownstone as well, which I can never remember. Well, look at brownstone from the Urals, look it up, it's very nice. But yeah, you and the tourism boards market these things, go to these gorges and these big, beautiful, lush wildernesses. But in the summer, you can smell smoke. It's coming from stuff catching fire because it gets. I mean, people don't realise this if they've not lived in Russia. I mean, yes, it's very cold in the winter months, especially Siberia, the Urals. That makes, again, convenience harder. Especially because Moscow, they clean the streets every day. They don't
With
always...
water.
With water. They spray the dirt to the other side of the street. Now, most cities do that, but a lot don't. And so the snow just piles up. They just sort of shovel it. That's what they did in Vladimir. So then when it melts, March is horrible in Siberia and in the Urals because the snow melts and it's just slush. It's brown sludge. Looks like a dirty pond, the road, and it ruins your clothes. And then the summer months come, but it is, to get to the point I was initially, it's unbelievably hot. It can get up to plus 37, 38 in Siberia.
Dusty?
And dusty. And the mosquitoes are massive. And so these things do matter because it's like, well, I could get a much cheaper flat. And there are some good schools in places like Tyumen, for instance. There's a good university in Tyumen. But you then have to, what are the trade-offs with that? To moving away from the European capital. Because, again, a lot of these things Johnny was talking about, the flat parks and the green space, it's modelled on what Western countries do, really, let's be honest.
Yeah, I think it was interesting when we started this video, Jeremy mentioned this UN sort of livability index. And if I were to make my own personal livability index, I would think about different things. So, like you mentioned, ecology, that would be one of them. Think as though I don't think the ecology in Moscow's that bad, but maybe I'm just used to it because everyone else says it's terrible. Think as though Moscow, for me, it would still rank near the top in a lot of categories. So, public transport, ease of access to services, everything being within reach, so you never really have to leave your area if you don't want to. That also works brilliantly. Then you can add the nightlife, the restaurants, the sheer number of cultural things to do, museums, galleries, concerts. It's really hard to beat. On the negative side, then, I would have always said winter weather, poor quality of free healthcare, insane bureaucracy for migrants, despite all these sort of e-governance changes. But post-war, there's a lot of things I'd like to add on top of that now. So I think a livability index today would be totally different. For example, travel. Sure, going to Dubai or Shanghai is still easy, but popping over to Prague for a weekend isn't. And those are sort of incredibly connected airports used to be a part of Moscow's appeal for me. And that sense of
Yeah, you
freedom,
could
I think, is
still...
gone.
I
Yeah,
flew to
I
San
would say
Francisco from Moscow, yeah.
yeah, so that's huge and that's changed. I think I would say on sanctions, I don't think they've really ruined the city's livability at all, but the loss of Visa and MasterCard makes life complicated for new arrivals and even Russians who can't use their cards to buy things from foreign companies online. Uh, and honestly, I guess the big thing is Moscow is just not cheap anymore. When I first moved here, I sort of felt like a king. And now, even with a much better income than I had when I was a student or just coming out of university, I still catch myself thinking, bloody hell, this used to cost half as much before the war.
If I may just jump in on that, because my own livability index, I mean, all the things Johnny just listed, I have those in, I have good shops and restaurants. Now, something viewers may not know about me, I'm celiac, so I need gluten-free food. Now, when I first moved to Russia, that just didn't exist and no one knew what that was. And it was a bit hard sometimes eating out. But now you've got all of those products are here, and it's quite common. It's quite even popular in some cases to have these, they call them diet products in the supermarket. I mean, we have all of that stuff. We just have it on a much smaller scale. And just to go back to the ecology thing, because, all Russians have a dacha, or many of them do. Why? They want the fresh air. They want to escape the city. So they will travel 2-3 hours, sometimes 4 hours, up to another region that they don't necessarily have a connection to, just to get access to that countryside, to the untouched green spaces. And now again, where we are, you have less to go to get that, but you still obviously have the environmental risks. And I mean, about water quality, I mean, one thing, maybe Jeremy can come in on, and Johnny's travelled a lot, but you notice the water's different colours in different parts of the country when you turn on the taps. Sometimes it's a browny colour in Siberia. And again, in the Far East, it's right by the Pacific Ocean, so it has entirely different water quality, which, we don't often talk about people that live all the way out on the 4,000 kilometres of Pacific coastline.
So, yeah, I mean, Johnny's talked about how he would reinterpret what livability means. And James, you've said a little bit about the ecology and things like water quality, again, which historically, water quality in Moscow and St. Petersburg was very poor. And still, one thing that we should say is that a lot of people don't drink water out of the tap in
I do.
These cities. Some people do.
I do as well.
Right.
No, but
again, maybe that's a reflection of how much things have changed, in that people my age wouldn't drink out of the tap.
No, it's just being British.
Or being British, but...
Again, I'm talking from the perspective
it is just being British, because Russian people never do, no matter how old they are. Younger than me, older than me, nobody ever would dream of it.
But Russian households, they have a jug of water, don't they, with a bit of silver, and that's quite a common thing. They still do that. We've got one with because the silver gives it awesome mineral quality with the silver.
Some minerals, yeah.
I don't know if that's true or not, but
what we're touching on is, in fact, where the one area where Moscow, of course, lags pretty much any city that you could probably think about, at least in Western Europe, and that's equity, right? So again, we talked about the metro being very, very convenient, and it's actually affordable. But of course, owning a car is a completely different proposition, even though a lot of Muscovites, because they're very, very privileged in relation to the rest of the country, do own cars. But equity, of course, was the one area where I guess Moscow's probably got even worse. And that's, again, because of things that you talked about, Johnny, which is the cost of living being so much higher than it was before, and which is so much higher and has always been so much higher, the cost of living, than elsewhere, even though Muscovites get all of these subsidies that the rest of the country doesn't get, right? So, I mean, for me, just very recently, one of the things that stuck out, because I used to drive a car in Moscow, but I haven't for many years because I'm not insane. And I was driving with my friend, and he thought nothing of paying what would be the equivalent of a day's wages for some people just to go on a toll road to save 20 minutes of his time in leaving Moscow to drive to his dacha James talked about. So again, even the having a dacha or not as a Muscovite, or indeed any other metropolitan dweller, is also part of equity, because we think of it, the three of us probably think of it as normal, having a dacha. But of course, it's also part of equity. Having access to a place that you go for the summer, again, because think about what James talked about, 37 degrees in the summer. Do you want to spend 2 months at 37 degrees in a city without air conditioning?
And often these dachas, people don't realise, again, for people that might not have spent a lot of time in Russia or at a dacha, some of them don't have plumbing. They have a toilet that's a hole in the ground that you have to spray with a hose and some little powder to get the smell to go away. But another thing I think we should mention, as a sort of socialist hangover, if you want to call it that, a lot of Muscovites became millionaires overnight just by virtue of where their property was. They inherited property that their parents or grandparents had that was in a very central location. And there was this thing in the 90s, this phenomenon known as the pensioner beggars. They were millionaires because they had all these assets, but they had no money. And that's something it still continues a bit. You inherit your parents' flats and you either sell it for a bigger, or you move into that yourself because might be prohibitively you inherit the dacha and you just put all your old shit there. Sorry, I shouldn't swear, but that's one of my so there is, again, that I think affects the quality of life, and Muscovites again are more privileged in that example. And I was going to say something else that I've forgotten about.
Can I come in just really
make a
quickly,
comment.
James? Go on, your point.
Yeah.
All right, go on, Johnny.
No, you go on, Jeremy.
Well, I was just going to say on the property, inheriting property, we should also say that there is a quirk of, again, the transition from communism to capitalism, that a lot of people held property essentially as a share of in their family. So it's not like individual property ownership in the West, right? A lot of these flats were gifted, well, they were all gifted by the state to be held in perpetuity, essentially by the family. And so when you then transition to a market economy, you might have, let's say you are lucky enough to have a 3-bedroom flat in the center of Moscow, and you are the one of 2 children. When your parents die, you inherit that 50-50 with your brother or sister, right? But it may also be that, you inherit other property. And that's really where the kind of privilege of Muscovites is leveraged. It's inheriting more than one property, partly as a result of this quirk of property being owned in shares by families.
And smaller families as well.
And the norm of the one, I said 2 children, but increasingly it became 1 child. And today the norm is 1 child. Johnny.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on the dacha thing. The thing is, when we talk about equity, and there's people who are rich and poor who have dachas. But what happens nowadays, people move to Moscow for work. So if you're from the middle of nowhere, your family has a house in the city, and then you have a dacha, 30 to 45 minutes away from the city. If you move to Moscow, you don't have access to that dacha anymore. So there's also this thing where people move to Moscow for the money, for everything that Moscow can offer, but they're also losing access to that dacha because they're never going to be able to afford a dacha that good in Moscow Oblast unless they hit it big. They're working in a job which makes them loads and loads of money. So I think that's one really interesting thing about if we combine sort of dacha plus the Moscow lifestyle, which means that so many Muscovites here are privileged, but the vast majority of people who live here, they're not from decades and decades, generations and generations of Muscovite families.
That's true, yeah. Yeah, we should also say that there's a big, not a class, well, there are class divisions, but there's also like an old and new Muscovite division where these 2 groups look down upon each other, right? And as you said, Johnny, if you've lived in Moscow for generations, you've probably built up a significant amount of real capital as a result of inheriting properties and their value ballooning astronomically. But as you said, we should also say that probably the majority of Muscovites are only 2nd-generation Muscovites.
Yes, right.
And may well be living on 1 or 2 white collar incomes, which really don't go very far, especially since COVID and the war.
What's interesting?
They're dismissively called office plankton by other Muscovites, right?
Office plankton, yeah.
Office plankton, but they are the new Muscovites essentially, and this is why I guess they work hard and they and they party hard as well. And this is also part of the vibe.
Yeah, and I mean, that old saying, Moscow doesn't believe in tears. I mean, what it really means is, you move to Moscow with your problems, and it's like, well, you're just, like you say, you're plankton in a sea of sharks that are good. They're not waiting for somebody from the countryside. But one other thing that's started happening again recently as well, and my mother-in-law, who works at the government hospital for the Sverdlovsk region, hospital workers are getting dibs on certain apartment blocks, and they get them at discounted rates as well. So it's not like in the Soviet Union where, here's your flat, thank you for your service. It's, you can buy, at, because the one they had, it was 50%, I think, was the discount. Trouble was, again, it was on a brown site in the middle of, it was on the outskirts of the city centre. There's not much there yet, but it's, I suppose they're trying to prepare people. They've all gone now as well, which is the interesting thing, that particular block. I don't know if much of that goes on in Moscow, but certainly it's becoming more popular in the regions.
Well, in Moscow, there are some forms of that, but they're a little bit different. I mean, there's a countrywide thing where if you're a woman and you have 3 kids, you get a free flat. So I suppose
Yeah.
that's a sort of thank you for your service payment too. And there's also all these veterans coming back from Ukraine, and they're not getting free apartments, but they're getting help with their deposit, and then they're getting preferential mortgages, something like I think 6 or 7% compared to the rate that everyone gets, which is in the 20s. Um,
Yeah.
so there is a
But
sort
that's
of
just
You get
driving the
for
cost
having
for
kids
everybody
that can
up.
be yeah.
That's just driving the cost of housing up for everybody. I mean, it's
Yes.
just displacing the problem. And yeah, I mean, this is just typical of the poor governance and the poor urban governance in Russia, which is that you can carve out little sectors as much as you like for privileged groups, but it just displaces the cost. And as we said in the previous video, even in Moscow, construction companies can't keep up with demand. And in fact, now because most subsidies for mortgages have been taken away, despite what we just said, most people don't have access to subsidised mortgages. Essentially, the government's going to have to bail out most construction companies in 2026.
Yes.
And nobody knows what's going to happen. But I certainly wouldn't be getting a mortgage right now if I was a Russian.
No, unless it's in the middle of the country, because there's that rural mortgage as well, isn't there, where you can move to a depopulating village.
And good luck with getting a job.
And good luck with getting a job or sustainable internet. Or I think my documentary, the money you get for having kids, that can go towards, but it can't anymore because they're, because no one can get a mortgage. So I think if we were to begin to wrap up, we would kind of say, so is Moscow the most livable city in the world still? Well, yes, for now. That would be my view. But
Yes, if you have enough money.
if you have enough money, yeah.
I think I'm not sure if I could say yes because this is the only place I've really lived for a very very long time. But I would say that pre-war, Moscow definitely felt like you had the best of both worlds. It was like a European high standard lifestyle at half the cost. Um, so that was great. But things have changed. Some things have improved, like we talk about the way that bureaucracy is going electronic, which is good. We talk about infrastructure, but there's also negative sides too. It's the livability of Moscow for me depended a lot on connection to the outside world. Um, it's a smart city that sort of runs smart inside its borders, but globally it's a little bit more isolated, like a sort of a high-tech island, not only in Russia, but in the world. And of course, I think inequality is deepened. So if you've got loads of money, then Moscow is super livable because you've got this comfort which relies on cheap migrant labor and a low-paid service class. I think you mentioned, Jeremy, the imbalance here is sharper now because inflation and sanctions have bitten hard. No matter people can say sanctions don't work, but we can definitely see that in ways they have worked. So you can still live well here, and it's sort of a local Moscow prosperity, but it's not this sort of global one that it once was. So my answer to the question, is it the most livable city in the world? It's really, really, really livable, and it's a great place, and I don't want to live anywhere else. But I don't know if the trajectory is positive or negative right now because there are pros and cons over the last 3 years.
James, do you want to have a final word and then I'll wrap up?
Well, my final word would just be to encourage people to go beyond the two capitals, especially if you are a scholar or an expert on Russia. You know, there is a very big country out there that you're not seeing. So,
yes, I mean, that's a good topic for a future podcast video. I mean, I came to this topic because I spent a lot of time in Moscow before I ever went anywhere else. And I consider myself, in my heart, I'm partly a Muscovite because it's where I've lived probably longer than anywhere else when I became an adult. Although I have lived in London as well. So I do feel I can compare it. And having said that, like James said, after a while, the experience in living in other places in Moscow, other places than Moscow, led me to have more of a love-hate relationship with Moscow. So I love going back to Moscow because of the nightlife, because of the ability to access, and we didn't talk about this, the ability to access cultural life, right? And what do I mean by that? I mean, you can still, and this is also a legacy of the Soviet period, you can still go and see a huge variety of theatre, music, high culture products, right? And you can't do that in a lot of other cities in the world now, in this post-COVID age. You can also go to Moscow, not necessarily, as James said, as a scholar, but as somebody open to the rich variety of a global city, and say that however much the Moscow government has been guilty of cultural vandalism, like pulling down buildings instead of renovating them, and certain famous buildings mysteriously burnt down when it was convenient to developers. Again, not necessarily a Russian problem. You know, we've seen that in places like Manchester, right?
Yes.
But if you go there with open eyes, you've got some of the most remarkable, 19th century, 20th century architectural gems, Russian Art Nouveau, National Romantic style. And so for me now, that's what I kind of cling on to, that however much it's been overdeveloped without really regard to heritage, what people call heritage, even the Moscow government hasn't been able to ruin its heritage. You know, you could go there and see amazing.
It still has its character.
Architectural gems, even outside the centre, and it is still a Soviet city. There's still all of this very interesting Soviet infrastructure, Soviet buildings. The government tends to kind of completely neglect them, but not totally. So it's a love-hate relationship, but I think what we'll end on is the fact that however much we love Moscow, there is a world outside it that is severely neglected by Russia watchers, by people that love Russia and are interested in Russia. And getting beyond Moscow will be an important part of what we do in this podcast.